Elizabeth. Hi, and good morning. And thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about creativity, which is a subject which I feel very, very passionate about. As the World Economic Forum has already indicated, the capacity to think differently, to come up with new ways of solving old problems is going to be one of the 3 critical skills that businesses need. So I'm delighted to work with organisations to help them to solve new problems by different ways of thinking.
Okay, and well, people have very different ways of expressing their views on creativity. Some people think that creativity is a gift, others seem to think that it's more of a skill. You know, what's your positioning on that? Do you think of creativity as a gift, as a talent, or as a skill?
That's a really good question. And I know myself, I actually held myself back from being creative because I had a mindset that was that I wasn't creative. And it's amazing how much that mindset is a barrier. Yes, certainly there are people who are artistic, who we think they're very, very creative, but I don't think that, I think everyone can be creative. I think that they need to be given sort of the time and the space and the encouragement, and we can all be encouraged to think differently. So I don't think it's a monopoly held by a few people who are born creative.
Yes, I suppose that's to do with the way we're defining it. So when you had the mindset that you're not very creative, perhaps that's because your perspective on creativity at that point was you thought of creativity as a gift. And maybe you were, when you were saying that I'm not very creative, what you really meant was that you're not musical, or you don't draw, or, you know, something which is associated with a natural gift. Whereas when you think about it as a skill, well, if it is a skill, then surely, like literacy, like numeracy, people can develop that skill.
That's a good point, and I agree completely. It's absolutely a skill that everyone can acquire, as long as they have a mindset and they're in a framework where they're open to, like any skill, it needs to be practiced. It's not you do it once and you remember how to do it. Yeah, absolutely, I agree with the skill philosophy.
And there's like different stages of the creativity process, like imagination, creativity, innovation. Do you think that we can teach people to have better imaginations? And if so, how can we do that?
That's a good question. Can we teach people to have better imagination? I don't know that I have an answer for that question off the top of my head. Can we encourage people to have better imagination? The optimist in me says absolutely yes, but again, it relates back to the previous comment about sort of mindset and willingness. And it's about understanding socialization, how we've been brought up. I mean, we've all been, you know, socialized through education, through our family, through cultural influences, and they've had a really strong and often an invisible influence on us, and that's something that can limit our thinking. And we need to know ourselves and to understand those things that have socialized us and which may have framed our thinking. And I think once we have a better understanding of ourselves, then we're in a better position to practice imagination.
Right. Yeah. The reason I asked you that question is because you talked about mindset, and it seems obvious that everyone has an imagination, and some people's imagination is not as creative as others. You know, like some people think about the worst case scenario, they imagine the worst, and some people always imagine the best. And is there some sort of, you know, is there a way of teaching people to imagine best case scenarios rather than worst case scenarios? And is that ethical?
Sure.
Is it ethical though?
Is it ethical? So there's 2 questions there. So first part was, is there a process? And there are a number of processes, and I can quote one that's been around for ages, which is, for example, Edward de Bono's 6-hat thinking, which basically you look at a problem and you only look at sort of the things that you feel about it. So you get all your fears and your concerns out. And then you have another process where you're not allowed to talk about your fears and your concerns. You only look at the objective information. And you take it stage by stage, and you show people that we can think at any one point in time, we can have a certain perspective. And when we're looking at a complex problem, it's useful to have a range of perspectives. Because they have complexity and ambiguity, and they're messy, and so let's just define all those things that make it a messy and a complex problem.
Right.
Now, the second part of your question, Gisbert, can you give that back to me again?
Yeah, it's about the ethics of it, because
The ethics.
you see, because over the last couple of decades, there's been this kind of the positive psychology movement, you know, the success psychology, and some people argue about the ethics of that, because some people, you know, for some, it's a good idea to think about the worst case scenario, because in a way that protects us from danger. You know, it's a natural way of like not being depressed because we don't achieve what we wanted to achieve. We were expecting not to achieve it.
That's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about, and it's a good question. And I guess it's all about context and implications and risk. You know, you have to understand risk. You know, what's the problem you're trying to solve, and what are the implications? I need to give this some more thought. This is a very good and very complex question, which has could have significant implications.
Okay, so yeah, the purpose of these conversations is just to see like what is it that we are absolutely clear about, and what is it that is still kind of like a little bit ambiguous that we still need to discuss further. So it's through discussions and through conversation that we know what is you know, common sense for those of us who are interested in creativity, and what is you know, maybe converting that common sense to good sense, you know, and that requires a lot of reflection, doesn't it?
Yeah, all these things are going through my mind. What are we clear about? What are we not clear about? I mean, sometimes I feel like I know a lot. Sometimes I feel like I know nothing at all. And I think actually it's good to be humble and to recognize that we only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And you always need to be open to the possibility that you probably don't have all the information. Right. And if you hold that as a thought, then you actually are more willing to accept more information, which may actually mean that you actually have to change your position. So it's a moving feast. It's interesting. So the original and valuable, it's Teresa Ramabel is sort of one of the major thinkers in the creativity space, and she sort of defines creativity around new ideas that are useful. And it's all around, and I think there's that, the usefulness. I mean, sometimes new ideas are, you know, if I use the perhaps overused metaphor of blue sky thinking, they're way out there and we don't know what to do with them, but they're interesting. Are they of value? And they are of value because maybe we don't actually have all the information that we need to make them useful. I think in terms of solving complex problems, imagination and creativity should actually help us to solve many, many, many problems. So there should be a value, but maybe we actually can't see the value once the new idea is first proposed.
And maybe those ideas might be valuable perhaps at some point in the future. Maybe they're not valuable now. So absolutely no. Absolutely. We need to look at it in the wider context of, and where place and the environment, the culture is important.
Yeah. I remember someone saying to me once that when you hear something that's new and unusual, you just kind of need to sort of park at the moment. So I just don't have enough information at this stage. And I think that's actually a good way to deal with it. I just don't know enough about that culture or the situation or that problem, rather than because otherwise, if we base things upon what we know now, then we just miss it and we move forward and we close off opportunities.
That's right. Yes. So when you're working with creativity in the work that you do, how do you enable people to be more creative?
How to enable people to be? Oh wow, there's so much. That's a big question. I mean, there's the very beginning. It's all about how people show up and why they're with you in the room and what's their motivation, how they've turned up that day. Because while they may well be very motivated to come and to explore new ideas, something may have happened. So it's about understanding all of that. It's about there's lots to do with the individual themselves, and as I said, how they've been socialized. There's so much to understand about the team and the processes, and really, for any creativity to be undertaken, it comes from a position with a heart of trust. And if any community or team doesn't have trust, then there really isn't going to be creativity because it's too risky. And that's just the starting point. And then, of course, you look at your processes, and it's about understanding people's preferences. Some people are very extroverted, some people are introverted. You know, do your processes allow for both types of reflection and contribution to be considered and to be used?
So is your approach to creativity beginning at the psychological perspective? So do you look at...
I guess it depends on the application, where you're being asked to use it. Often it's a conversation with a manager, and it's a bit about understanding themselves and their own preferences and their own biases and their own objectives.
And what's the role of the unconscious? Because when you talk about biases, immediately the word I associate with bias is unconscious. And as a, you know, from a psychological point of view, you know, how important is the role of the unconscious?
Oh, it's hugely important. It's hugely important. I know both from my research and from my own experience that even when you're not consciously working on a problem, your brain is working on it. And it's actually kind of good to know it, because sometimes, you know, you just need to walk away. You get stuck in a problem and all the details, and you walk away, and you go off and you take a walk, or you think about something else, and your brain continues. I know myself, I'll often go to bed with a problem. In the morning, I'll wake up and just suddenly the solution will be there because my brain's been working. And I know through my PhD research, I had some of my participants describe the same situation, that they wouldn't be thinking about something and the idea would be there. So you know, there's this natural incubation period, and that's the invisible bit. We don't often see the brain soaking and working on a problem even when we're not there. Something may happen, we may get exposed to some stimuli or some new idea, and suddenly all this information we've collected before suddenly makes sense. So it's a tough one. The unconscious is really, really important, but we're not aware of often how our unconscious works.
And it's because we're not aware of how the unconscious works. This kind of leads me to go back to what I was saying earlier, that some people are naturally positive and others are naturally negative in their tendencies. And the unconscious, sometimes it's very beneficial, the ideas that we come, and there are dark forces in our unconscious as well. You know, there are dark forces that sabotage our projects, and, you know, how do we deal with that in terms of creativity, which is ethical and life enhancing, and, you know, the ideas that are self-destructive?
Yeah. How we as a person, if I'm a member of a team, or if I'm facilitating a creativity session, we need to be aware of ourselves and how we react to an idea and why we may react to it. So you mentioned people who are very, very positive and people who are very, very negative. For those people, I'd be encouraging them perhaps to think about, you know, what's driven that disposition, because both have value. Obviously, to be creative, you need to be open to more and more ideas, and an open and positive disposition is important for that. But then people who are cautious, you know, are often cautious because of organizational culture. You know, you get punished if you fail, for example. So their conservatism is well placed, and it's actually useful to have someone in the room, particularly if you're developing an idea to a problem in an organization that has implications beyond your team.
Well, I'm thinking about examples such as Steve Jobs. Now, Steve Jobs is renowned for being a, you know, extremely creative person, and yet there were unconscious dark forces in his life which led to relationships that were destructive. And, you know, not everything, when we look under the surface of the creativity that he expressed, not everything was hunky-dory, not everything was positive.
Oh, I can't comment on dark forces and Steve Jobs. I'm not well enough informed in that area.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. It's just, you know, just throwing out ideas of, like, you know, examples.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting when you started talking about Steve Jobs, of course, you know, we're talking about what you know and what you don't know. And we know that Steve Jobs had a love of calligraphy, didn't he? And that actually influenced the fonts that he used. And it was a bit of information you think might be completely unrelated to where his life might go, but everything you learn, you can pull together and you can use at some stage or another. Yeah, that was coming from, I don't think he had a great time at university. Yes, all experiences. We are the sum of our experiences.
well, that's another point, you see, that you know, very highly creative people often don't fit in with traditional compulsory education. You know, they find their truest learning outside of the outside of the traditional education system. Good.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, and we need to have an appetite for learning, continuous learning. One of the key things you get from any formal study is just a willingness to take on a new body of knowledge and then to soak and to read and to learn, then that will be a key skill going forward, because you need to be able to learn. And sometimes formal learning programs, I guess it takes away that initiative and that curiosity. But they're very, very key components, very, very important life skills.
And did you find that when you were engaged with your PhD research, that kind of learning was quite distinct to, for example, when you were doing your undergraduate degree?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. By the time you do your PhD, you've got to be autonomous. You've got to be creative. You've got to go through all the dredge as well. There's dredge as well as creative stuff. I mean, you know, think about you're always looking for the grain of sand stuff that's new, but all the new stuff comes from pulling together all the disparate threads of all the old stuff and the research that's gone before you. So it's using multiple skills.
And it requires years of preparation, doesn't it, to find out where the gaps are in the knowledge?
And some good mentors and supervisors and people, yeah, to help you along the way, yeah.
But it seems a shame that, you know, for some people, they have to wait until they're actually doing a PhD to be autonomous like that, to be creative in their learning, whereas the years before, like even up to the master's degree, it's basically producing something that meets the expectations of the course, rather than something which is original and valuable in its own right.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of, you know, why do you do any education? Why do you do, say, an MBA? And for a lot of people, it's the sort of the cachet that comes with those 3 letters. And people are there to do what's required to get the 3 letters, and perhaps don't embrace the learning experience that comes with the course of study.
Yes.
That is what it is. But there's some people who I know who haven't had formal education, who are very bright, who read widely, who pay attention to their environment, who are highly imaginative and creative. I mean, I love formal education, but you can learn in so many other ways.
Yes, and I suppose those who've learned in their own ways, they have practiced a lot more autonomy, and they've learned things that they're truly passionate about, which saves a lot of time. Whereas in compulsory education, a lot of learning is about things which are not necessarily relevant to our own lives.
Well, it's hard, maybe relevant at that time.
Yeah. For example, I sometimes see teenagers learning about pensions, and you know, it might not be relevant to them at that point in time, but when they actually need it, they might have totally forgotten what they learned in school.
Yeah. Well, the capacity to learn is the skill. And, you know, we have such an easy access to information. I mean, I still think of Google and other search engines like magic. I mean, I can't, you know, when I think about my undergraduate degree and how that wasn't available, and you'd have to go to the library and find the information. So you have no excuse now. The information is there. You just need to spend the time reading it. Note what you understand, and note the stuff that you don't understand. And when you're talking about the PhD, the greatest thing I think I got out of it was just being clear. When I don't understand something, I'd always try and describe in as much detail as possible what it was that I didn't understand. And then my conscious mind and that process of incubation worked to sort of pull it together and to make sense for me.
Yes, so it's because at the PhD level, there's probably no one else in the world that understands that either. So you can't just go to Google to find the answer for it.
Yeah, yeah.
It requires that incubation, as you say. It requires that unconscious synthesis of knowledge that you've acquired previously to come up with those original ideas that you obviously put forward in your PhD. You know, PhD is an excellent example of creativity because it's both original and valuable.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yes. What we don't already know. See, I don't know all the things we don't know. And who's our audience? Who are we talking to? I think, as I said at the beginning, it is such a critical skill. You know, if we look broadly at the environment, you know, a complex geopolitical environment, organisations with short life cycles, creativity has been identified as one of the critical skills. And for that reason alone, it's worth time investing in our children, in our teenagers and in adults in developing that skill. If they are to be successful and communities to be successful, and indeed countries and governments are to be successful.